Okay, this lesson is regarding the Edgenuity lesson, rational equations. So the first thing I want to talk about is how do you know when to cross multiply when you're solving these rational equations, and how do you know when to multiply by the least common denominator? So what the difference is, I'll zoom out for a second so you can see. If you ever have fraction equals a fraction, that's when you want to cross multiply. So I have one fraction here equals one fraction here. So this one I can cross multiply and solve. This one, that's not what we have. We have a fraction equals a fraction plus another thing. So if there's ever plus or minus something else, you can't cross multiply. You have to multiply by the least common denominator whenever you have another thing there, kind of like here. We have a fraction plus a fraction. Automatically can't cross multiply because of that having another part over there. So another thing they talked about is extraneous solutions. So whenever you're working with fractions, when you get to your answer, you just need to double check that your answer doesn't make the denominator 0. Okay, so on this first one, so like I said, we don't have fraction equals fraction because we have this extra little thing over here. So this is one we have to multiply by the least common denominator. So over here, I'm going to write out what all my denominators are. And then the denominator on a whole number is just 1. That's 3 over 1. So that's not really going to do anything for our equation. So remember, when you're finding the least common denominator, you need to factor everything that you can first. So x plus 1, there's nothing we can do there. X squared minus 1, now remember this is a difference of squares because this is x squared minus 1 squared because 1 times 1 is still 1. So the way that difference of squares factor is x plus 1, x minus 1. Okay, so everything from our first denominator goes down into our least common denominator. So x plus 1. Now, looking at our second denominator, this x plus 1 times x minus 1, we already have a factor of x plus 1 down there. So I'm not going to include that. That's just going to make our denominator bigger. But we do not have a factor of x minus 1. So that's going to come down into our least common denominator. Having this 1 here, multiplying everything by 1 isn't going to change anything, so we can ignore that guy. So now we know what our least common denominator is. And what we're going to do to solve this one is we're going to multiply this entire equation by x plus 1, x minus 1. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take this and we're going to have to distribute it to all 3 parts. So what ends up happening is we get 4x plus 1 and then times the x plus 1, x minus 1 all over this factor down here of x plus 1 equals 12 times x plus 1, x minus 1 over, now just as a reminder, this x squared minus 1, I'm going to go ahead and factor it. We've already done it over here, so we already know that this is going to become x plus 1, x minus 1 plus 3 times x plus 1, x minus 1. Okay, so all of these things are being multiplied, right? So if you have the same factor on top and bottom, you can cancel them out. So these x plus 1s are gone. And now we have 4x plus 1 times x minus 1 equals, over here we have x plus 1, x minus 1 on both the top and bottom. So they actually both cancel out and we're just left with 12. Now this one here, if I multiply this out, so if I do x plus 1 times x minus 1, first, outside, inside, last, those cancel and you just get x squared minus 1. So we have 3 times the quantity x squared minus 1. Okay, so now that all of our fractions are gone, we're going to have to FOIL here and use the distributive property here. So I'll go a little slower on this one. So first is 4x times x, so that gives me 4x squared. Outsides, 4x times negative 1 is minus 4x. Insides, 1 in x is just positive x. And then last, 1 times negative 1 is minus 1. And then here all I have to do is distribute the 3. So we end up with 3x squared minus. Okay, so if I combine my like terms on the left and the right, we end up with 4x squared minus 3x minus 1 equals 3x squared plus 9. Okay, so whenever you have an x squared and a plain x in your equation, you're gonna have to factor if the x squareds don't cancel each other out. So when that happens, so say I have an x squared and an x, I'm gonna get everything on one side and factor. So I'm gonna subtract 3x squared, and I'm gonna subtract 9. So that gives us x squared minus 3x minus 10 equals 0. Okay, so thinking back to our factoring flowchart, which remember, if you want a copy of this, I can send it to you in an email, and it tells you kind of like how you decide how to factor. We have 3 terms here, and there's no number in front of the x squared. So we can just do what multiplies to negative 10 and adds to negative 3. Multiplies to negative 10 and adds to negative 3, and that would be negative 5 and positive 2. So remember, when we have it equal to 0, we're not done yet. You have to solve each of those. So I have to say either x minus 5 had to be 0 or x plus 2 has to be 0. Add 5 to both sides. Subtract 2 from both sides. Okay, so like I said, we're dealing with fractions, so you have to make sure that if I plug these back into the original equation, are the denominators going to be 0? So if I plug in 5, nope, that denominator is 6, and this denominator would be 24. If I plug in negative 2, nope, that's going to be negative 1, and that's going to be 3. So as long as you plug it back into the bottom and you don't get 0, the answers work, the solutions work. Okay, so on this next one, this is where I was talking about we have a fraction equals a fraction. So on this one, you can go ahead and just cross multiply, which makes it a lot easier. So we have 2 times x minus 1 equals 1 times x squared minus x. So if I distribute the 2, I'm going to put 2x minus 2. And if I distribute the 1, we still just get x squared minus x. Now again, we have an x squared and an x in our equation. So we have to get everything on one side and factor. So 0 equals x squared minus 3x plus 2. Again, 3 terms, no number in front of our x squared. So we have to decide what multiplies to positive 2. When you multiply them, you get positive 2. But when you add them, you get negative 3. Be negative 1 and negative 2. So not done yet because it says it equals 0. So either x minus 1 had to equal 0 or x minus 2 had to equal 0. So if I add 1 to both sides, if I add 2 to both sides. Okay, so now let's plug it back in and check. Okay, so if I plug 1 in, over here I can already tell, I'm going to get 1 minus 1. That gives us a denominator of 0. So this is an extraneous solution. It's not part of our solution set. Let's try 2 though. So if I plug in 2 over here, I get 2 minus 1, which works, so that's good. Over here when I plug in 2, I get 2 squared is 4, minus 2 is 2. So that one works as well. So there's only one solution here, and that one is extraneous.